A tiny kitten keeps following a giant dog for help, and when she realizes she can't hold back tears. At first, it looks like a strange friendship, a fragile little kitten chasing after a scarred, towering dog. But the truth behind their bond is nothing ordinary. Every step the kitten takes is a warning. Every scar on the dog hides a past darker than anyone dares to imagine. The woman who finds them thinks she's rescuing two strays. Instead, she's walking straight into a secret powerful people would do anything to keep buried. What is this tiny kitten trying to reveal? And when the truth finally comes out, will it save lives or destroy them? This space is built on something simple and enduring: the power of love, the truth and kindness, and the belief that quiet care can still change lives. The rain drummed steadily against the windows of Fairview Veterinary Clinic as Lydia Brenner gathered her belongings, ready to head home after another long shift. Her auburn ponytail had started to come loose, and she tucked a few stray strands behind her ear while pulling on her rain jacket. The clock on the wall showed 11:30 at night, and she sighed, knowing she'd have to be back early the next morning. Thunder rumbled overhead as she stepped outside, fumbling with her umbrella. The streetlights cast eerie yellow circles on the wet pavement, and the wind whipped at her clothes. That's when she saw it, a tiny shape huddled beneath the nearest lamppost, its wet fur plastered to its body. "Oh, you poor thing," Lydia whispered, taking a careful step toward the kitten. It was so small, probably only a few weeks old, with matted gray fur. But as she approached, something unexpected happened. Instead of running to her outstretched hand, the kitten turned and darted away into the shadows. "Wait," Lydia called out, following the kitten's path with her flashlight. The beam caught something that made her freeze in her tracks. There, in the darkness between two buildings, stood a massive dog, a mastiff with shoulders that nearly reached her waist. The sight of it made her heart skip a beat. The mastiff's face was marked with old scars, and what she saw around its neck made her gasp. A heavy chain was partially embedded in the flesh, the skin grown over it in places. The sight made her stomach turn, but what happened next left her even more bewildered. The tiny kitten fearlessly approached the huge dog, rubbing against its leg and looking back at Lydia with an almost human-like intelligence in its eyes. The mastiff, despite its fearsome appearance, lowered its head gently to nuzzle the kitten. "This is different," Lydia murmured, her veterinary assistant training kicking in as she assessed the situation. The mastiff's wounds needed immediate attention, but its size and condition made her hesitate. She'd seen enough abused animals to know that approaching them could be dangerous, yet the kitten seemed determined to change her mind. It kept moving between her and the mastiff, meowing insistently, as if trying to bridge the gap between them. The big dog remained perfectly still, watching her with deep brown eyes that held more pain than aggression. "Okay, little one," Lydia said softly, "I get the message." She slowly reached into her pocket and pulled out half a protein bar she'd forgotten to eat during her shift. With careful movements, she unwrapped it and tossed a piece toward the mastiff. The dog didn't lunge for the food. Instead, it waited until the kitten approached the morsel first, sniffed it, and only then did the mastiff gently take the offering. This simple interaction told Lydia volumes about their relationship. Rain continued to pour as Lydia made her decision. She couldn't leave them here, not with those wounds, not in this weather. The clinic was empty now, and she had access to everything she needed to help them. "Come on, both of you," she coaxed, holding the clinic door open. The kitten immediately understood, trotting toward the door, then stopping to look back at its large companion. The mastiff hesitated, the chain dragging heavily behind it. Once inside, Lydia's hands shook slightly as she turned on the lights. The mastiff's size was even more impressive in the bright clinic interior. It must have weighed at least 140 pounds. But as she watched, the giant dog carefully maneuvered around the waiting room furniture, clearly trying to avoid knocking anything over. The kitten led the way to the examination room as if it had done this before, jumping onto the metal table and meowing encouragingly at the mastiff. Lydia found herself amazed by their obvious bond. Despite their drastically different sizes and species, there was something almost magical about their connection. "Let's get you both dried off first," Lydia said, gathering towels from the supply cabinet. The kitten allowed her to wrap it in a soft towel, purring contentedly. The mastiff watched this interaction closely, and when Lydia approached with another towel, it lowered its head in acceptance. As she gently dried the massive dog, she could feel countless scars beneath its fur. The chain around its neck was worse than she'd initially thought. It would require surgery to remove properly. But what struck her most was how the kitten kept one paw on the mastiff's nose throughout the examination, as if offering comfort and support. "You two have been through something together, haven't you?" Lydia murmured, watching as the kitten curled up against the mastiff's neck, carefully avoiding the wounded areas. The big dog's tail thumped softly against the floor, and despite its fearsome appearance, Lydia saw nothing but gentleness in its eyes. This was more than just a random encounter between two strays. The way the kitten had deliberately led her to the mastiff, how they moved in sync with each other, their obvious concern for one another, it all pointed to something deeper. These animals weren't just companions. They were survivors who had formed an unbreakable bond through whatever hardship they'd endured. As Lydia began gathering supplies to clean the mastiff's wounds, she couldn't shake the feeling that she'd been chosen for this moment. The kitten's purposeful behavior, leading her to help its injured friend, seemed too deliberate to be coincidence. Whatever their story was, she was now part of it, and she knew her life would never be quite the same. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Lydia carefully cleaned the wounds around the mastiff's neck. Her hands trembled slightly, but her touch remained gentle. The massive dog lay quietly on the examination table, its dark eyes following her every movement with a mix of wariness and trust. The tiny kitten sat perched on a nearby counter, watching intently. "Easy there, big guy," Lydia murmured, dabbing antiseptic on the raw flesh where the chain had bitten deep. The mastiff flinched but didn't growl. As she worked to clean the worst of the injuries, something caught her eye, a small metal tag dangling from the embedded chain. Her heart skipped a beat as she leaned closer, wiping away grime to reveal an embossed emblem, a stylized K within a circle. Her stomach dropped. She knew that symbol all too well. It was Harold Kincaid's ranch logo. Lydia's hands went cold. Harold Kincaid wasn't just any rancher. He was Fairview's unofficial king, a man whose influence reached into every corner of their small town. Stories about his cruelty circulated in whispers, never loud enough to reach official ears. She'd heard rumors about missing animals, about workers who disappeared after speaking up against him. The mastiff let out a low whine, drawing her back to the present. "I'm sorry," she whispered, resuming her careful cleaning. "I won't let him hurt you again." But even as she said the words, fear crept up her spine. Taking in strays was one thing. Harboring animals that belonged to Harold Kincaid was something else entirely. She was still debating whether to call animal control when a quiet knock echoed through the clinic's back door. Lydia jumped, her heart racing until she recognized the familiar silhouette through the frosted glass. Jonas Kerr's tall frame filled the doorway as she let him in, his dark hair damp from the rain. "Thought I might find you here," he said softly, shrugging off his wet jacket. Word travels fast when someone brings in a dog that size. His eyes widened slightly at the sight of the mastiff, then narrowed as he took in the wounds. "That's not just any dog, is it?" Lydia shook her head, watching as Jonas approached the examination table. The mastiff's ears perked forward, but it remained calm. "I found him with this little one," she explained, gesturing to the kitten. "But Jonas, the chain, it's Kincaid's." Jonas's expression hardened. He'd grown up alongside Lydia in Fairview, and she could read the concern in his face. I was afraid of that, he said, running a hand through his hair. Listen, Lydia, you need to be careful. Kincaid, he's not just the man everyone sees at church on Sundays. There are things happening at that ranch, bad things. What kinds of things? Lydia asked, though part of her didn't want to know. Jonas moved closer, speaking in a low voice. Remember those dogs that went missing last summer? And that new farmhand who supposedly left town overnight? He glanced at the mastiff's scars. Let's just say there's a reason no one ever investigates too closely when Kincaid's name comes up. The kitten chose that moment to leap down, padding over to rub against Jonas's legs. Despite the tension, he smiled slightly. Got yourself quite a pair here. I couldn't leave them, Lydia said, her voice stronger than she felt. But Jonas, what am I supposed to do? If Kincaid finds out, you did the right thing, Jonas interrupted, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. And you're not alone in this. Whatever happens, I've got your back. He pulled out a piece of paper and scribbled down his number. Day or night, if anything feels off, you call me. Immediately. Lydia took the paper, her fingers brushing against his. For a moment, she saw something deeper than friendship in his eyes, but it was gone before she could be sure. What remained was an unwavering promise of support that made her feel both grateful and terrified. This wasn't just about helping injured animals anymore. She was stepping into something much darker, challenging a man who had held their town in his grip. For decades, the mastiff lifted its head, letting out a soft rumble as Jonas gave it a gentle pat. You've got more allies than you think, Jonas said quietly. Just be careful who you trust. He moved toward the door, pausing with his hand on the handle. And Lydia? Lock up tight tonight. As the door closed behind him, Lydia looked at her. Unlikely charges, the battle-scarred mastiff and the tiny kitten now curled up against its massive paw. The weight of what she'd taken on settled over her like a heavy blanket. She wasn't just their caretaker anymore. She was their protector, standing between them and a man who had never faced consequences for his actions. Her hands shook slightly as she finished bandaging the mastiff's wounds, but her resolve was growing stronger. Sometimes doing the right thing meant facing the wrong people, and for the first time in her life, Lydia understood exactly what that meant. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the clinic windows as Lydia finished bandaging the mastiff's neck. She had just disposed of the bloodied gauze when the front door chime rang, followed by heavy footsteps that made her spine stiffen. Two men in dusty ranch wear strode into the examination room. The taller one, with a weather-beaten face and cold eyes, spoke first. We're here for Kincaid's property. His gaze fixed on the mastiff who had risen to stand. Muscles tense despite his injuries. The kitten darted between the mastiff's legs, tiny back arched in defiance. Lydia drew herself up to her full height, though her heart hammered in her chest. This animal was found abandoned and injured. As a licensed veterinarian, I have a duty of care. That ain't your concern, the second man said, taking a step forward. That dog belongs to Mr. Kincaid, and we're taking it back, now. The threat in his voice was unmistakable. Lydia's hands trembled, but she planted herself between the men and the animals. The chain embedded in his neck tells a different story. I've documented the injuries. If you want to pursue this, we can involve the proper authorities. The door chimed again, and Lydia nearly sagged with relief as Jonas walked in. His normally easygoing expression had hardened as he assessed the situation. Everything okay here, Lydia? These gentlemen were just leaving, she said firmly, drawing strength from his presence. The taller man's face darkened. Mr. Kincaid doesn't take kindly to people interfering in his business. You do well to remember that. He jerked his head toward his companion, and they turned to leave, their boots echoing ominously on the linoleum floor. Jonas waited until their truck rumbled away before speaking. You okay? Lydia released a shaky breath. I think so. But this isn't over, is it? No, Jonas said quietly, it isn't. Kincaid doesn't like losing what he considers his. The Mastiff had relaxed slightly, but remained alert, his massive head turned toward the door. The kitten emerged from behind his legs, padding over to wind around Lydia's ankles with a soft mew dot as evening settled in. Lydia finished her closing duties with Jonas's help. She couldn't shake the chill of the confrontation, but watching the animals together strengthened her resolve. The kitten had curled up against the Mastiff's broad chest, tiny paws kneading the air as it drifted to sleep. The big dog's eyes remained alert, but there was peace in his expression as he watched over his small companion. I've never seen anything like it, Lydia said softly to Jonas as they observed the pair. The way that kitten found me led me to him. It's like they knew they needed help and chose to trust me. Which makes you responsible for them now, Jonas pointed out gently. Lydia nodded, watching as the Mastiff shifted slightly to better shelter the sleeping kitten. They've survived so much already. Together, I won't let Kincaid hurt them again. The weight of her words hung in the air, a promise that would demand more courage than she'd ever needed before. But looking at the unlikely pair, the tiny kitten and the battle-scarred Mastiff, she knew she had no choice. Their survival now depended on her willingness to stand against whatever came next. After the confrontation with Kincaid's men, Jonas stayed behind at the clinic, his weathered face etched with concern. He watched the kitten nestled against the Mastiff's broad chest, their unlikely bond evident in every gentle interaction. There's something you need to know about that dog, Lydia, Jonas said quietly, pulling up a chair beside her. And why those men really want him back. Lydia's hands trembled slightly as she organized medical supplies, still rattled from the earlier confrontation. What do you mean? Jonas leaned forward, his voice dropping lower. People talk at the feed store. For years, there've been whispers about what really goes on at Kincaid's ranch after dark. That Mastiff, he wasn't just a guard dog. Kincaid's been running illegal dog fights in his old barn. Lydia's heart clenched as she looked at the gentle giant resting on the clinic floor. The scars she'd treated suddenly took on a darker meaning. The injuries, they weren't just from neglect, were they? No, Jonas shook his head grimly. From what I've heard, this dog was Kincaid's champion fighter until he couldn't fight anymore. When he got too injured, he trailed off. His jaw tightening. They threw him away like garbage. The kitten mewed softly, padding across the floor to rub against Lydia's ankles. She bent down to scratch behind its ears, noticing how it immediately scampered back to the Mastiff's side. But the kitten, Lydia wondered aloud. How does it fit into all this? Jonas's expression softened as he watched the tiny creature snuggle against the massive dog. My guess is it was born somewhere on the ranch. Probably found safety with the Mastiff when it was just a newborn. You've seen how they are together. That little one wouldn't have survived without him. Understanding dawned on Lydia's face as she watched the pair. Every time she'd tried to separate them, the kitten had insisted on returning to the Mastiff's side. It wasn't just companionship, it was survival. The huge dog had been this tiny creature's only protection in that terrible place. I can't. Give them back, Jonas, Lydia said firmly, her earlier fear transforming into steely resolve. I won't. I know. Jonas nodded, but Kincaid's got connections. You should file a formal complaint, get the authorities involved. Lydia reached for her phone, determination set in her features. She called the local police first, then animal control. Each conversation left her more frustrated than the last. The police claimed there wasn't enough evidence to investigate. Animal control said they'd look into it, but their tone suggested otherwise. They're all in his pocket, aren't they? Lydia asked, though she already knew the answer. Jonas didn't respond immediately, watching as the Mastiff gently nuzzled the kitten with his scarred muzzle. Kincaid's got money and influence. He's been buying his way out of trouble in this town for years. The kitten began to purr, the sound surprisingly loud in the quiet clinic. The mastiff's tail thumped softly against the floor, his eyes, despite all they'd seen, showing nothing but gentleness as he watched over his tiny companion. Lydia knelt beside them, her hand resting lightly on the mastiff's broad head. The dog leaned into her touch, and she felt tears prick at her eyes as she thought about what he'd endured. The kitten immediately climbed into her lap, as if sensing her distress and offering comfort. "Look at them, Jonas," she whispered. "Everything they've been through, and they still trust. They still protect each other. How can anyone see them together and not understand?" "The question is," Jonas said gently, "what are you going to do now that the authorities won't help?" Lydia straightened her shoulders, watching as the kitten curled up against the mastiff's side, both of them finally peaceful in their sanctuary. "Whatever I have to, they're not going back there. Not ever." The conviction in her voice was absolute. She might not have the law on her side, but she had something stronger, the unshakable certainty that she was doing what was right. The kitten's desperate loyalty and the mastiff's gentle spirit had shown her that. Now it was her turn to protect them both. The evening shadows lengthened across the clinic floor as Lydia checked the mastiff's bandages one final time. His gentle brown eyes watched her every move, no longer holding the fear she'd first seen in them. The kitten, as always, stayed close by, batting playfully at the fresh gauze. "You're healing up nicely, big guy," Lydia murmured, gently patting his broad head. The chain marks around his neck were slowly fading, though the scars would always remain. Jonas entered through the back door, carrying a camera and a thick manila folder. "Got the photos developed," he said, spreading them across the examination table. "Clear shots of similar chains at Kincaid's property, matching the one we removed. And these," he pointed to several darker images, "underground kennels. Not the legal kind." Lydia's stomach turned as she studied the pictures. "Will it be enough? For a proper investigation? Should be." "But Lydia," Jonas ran a hand through his hair. "Every officer I've tried to show these to suddenly becomes very busy." A loud crash from the front of the clinic cut through their conversation. The mastiff's head snapped up, a low growl rumbling in his chest. The kitten immediately darted behind him. "Someone's breaking in," Jonas whispered, quickly gathering the photos. "Back door, now." Lydia's hands shook as she unlatched the mastiff's kennel. The dog moved with surprising quietness despite his size, positioning himself between them. And the sound of heavy boots in the reception area. "Come on," she whispered to the kitten, who needed no encouragement to follow the mastiff's lead. They slipped out into the cool night air just as voices echoed through the clinic. Jonas guided them toward his truck, parked in the shadows of the Koft and the shadows of the Kodasgav and the Sadovdan toward his truck, parked in the shadows of the building, looking for some animals that don't belong to you, Doc. A harsh voice called out. The sound of equipment crashing to the floor made Lydia flinch. The mastiff suddenly stopped, turning his massive head toward the clinic entrance. His muscles tensed, and Lydia could see the fighter he once was, ready to defend them. "No," she whispered firmly, touching his shoulder. "We need you safe." The dog's eyes met hers, and after a moment, he limped forward again. Jonas helped lift him into the truck bed, where they'd prepared blankets as a makeshift bed. The kitten scrambled up after him, immediately pressing close to his protector. They were barely on the road when headlights blazed behind them. Jonas took a sharp turn down a side street, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. "Hold on," he warned, taking them through a series of quick turns. Lydia twisted in her seat to check on their passengers. The mastiff lay low, his body curled protectively around the kitten. They drove for nearly an hour, taking back roads and doubling back until they were sure no one followed. Finally, Jonas pulled into an old barn on his family's property. "We can stay here tonight," he said, helping the mastiff down from the truck. "I've got some supplies stashed, and no one knows about this place except family." Lydia sank onto a hay bale, the adrenaline leaving her shaky. "He won't stop, will he, Kincaid?" "No," Jonas replied honestly, setting up battery-powered lanterns. "That dog knows too much. Could bring down his whole operation if the right people started asking questions." The Mastiff limped over to Lydia, resting his huge head on her knee. The kitten followed, climbing into her lap and reaching up to pat the dog's nose with a tiny paw. "Then we don't stop either," Lydia said, drawing strength from the animal's trust in her. "We keep gathering evidence. We find someone who'll listen." She looked up at Jonas. "We fight back." Jonas nodded, his expression grim but determined. "We fight back, but smart. That means keeping you and these two safe first." He gestured to their surroundings. "We'll figure out our next move in the morning. For tonight we rest." Lydia stroked the Mastiff's scarred head, watching as he settled onto the fresh hay with the kitten snuggled against his side. Despite everything they'd been through, the fighting ring, the abuse, tonight's violence, they remained unshakable. In their bond, their trust in each other, and now in her, gave her the courage to face whatever came next. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the clinic windows as Lydia organized medical supplies, trying to keep her hands busy to quiet her racing thoughts. The Mastiff lay in his usual spot near the reception desk, the kitten curled against his massive shoulder. Both animals lifted their heads at the sound of boots scuffing against the welcome mat. A thin man in dusty work clothes stood in the doorway, his weathered face partially hidden beneath the brim of a worn cowboy hat. His eyes darted nervously between Lydia and the windows. "Can I help you?" Lydia asked, instinctively moving closer to the animals. "Name's Tucker," he said in a low voice. "I worked at Kincaid's ranch." He pulled his hat lower, shifting from foot to foot. "Been there 15 years, seen things. Bad things." The Mastiff's ears perked up at the mention of Kincaid, but he remained calm, watching the newcomer with steady eyes. Tucker reached slowly into his jacket, causing Lydia to tense, but he withdrew only a thick manila envelope. "This here's proof. Of everything. The fights, the betting, the whole operation." His hands trembled as he placed it on the counter. "There's more than just the dogs. Way more." Lydia carefully opened the envelope, her breath catching as she saw photographs, ledgers, and handwritten notes. Her fingers traced over dates, locations, and dollar amounts that made her eyes widen. "It ain't just dog fighting," Tucker continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "That's just the cover. Kincaid's moving other things through those same channels. Drugs, stolen goods, you name it. The fights are just to explain all the traffic at the ranch, all the money changing hands." Just then, Jonas walked in through the back door, freezing when he saw Tucker. The ranch hand spun around, ready to bolt, but Jonas quickly raised his hands. "It's okay," Lydia said. "He's with me. Jonas, this is Tucker. He's bringing us what we need." Jonas approached carefully, examining the documents as Lydia spread them across the counter. His face grew increasingly grave as he flipped through the pages. "This is huge," he muttered. "Shipping manifests, bank statements, photos. This isn't just animal abuse anymore. This is organized crime." The Mastiff had risen to his feet, moving closer to examine Tucker. The ranch hand's eyes filled with tears as he looked at the dog. "I'm sorry, old boy. Should have done something sooner. Watched them work you nearly to death in those fights." He reached out a tentative hand, which the Mastiff sniffed before allowing a gentle pat. "Why now?" Lydia asked, still sorting through the damning evidence. Tucker straightened up, wiping his eyes. "Because you stood up to him. First person in this town who has in years. Made me realize maybe it ain't too late to do the right thing. You know this puts you at risk," Jonas warned. Tucker nodded. "Already packed my truck. Heading to my sister's in Oregon tonight. But you folks," he looked between them seriously, "you watch yourselves. Kincaid's got friends everywhere. Police, city hall, county office. The kitten had made its way to the counter, investigating the scattered papers with curious paws. The sight of the tiny animal next to evidence of such cruelty made Lydia's resolve harden. "We'll be careful," she promised. "And we'll make sure this gets to people who can't be bought." After Tucker left, Lydia and Jonas spent hours examining the documents, building a timeline of Kincaid's operation. The Mastiff stayed close, as if understanding the gravity of what was unfolding. His quiet presence, the steady sound of his breathing, helped calm Lydia's nerves as the full scope of their situation became clear. "Federal agencies," Jonas finally said, running a hand through his hair. "That's who we need to contact. This goes way beyond local jurisdiction." Lydia nodded, reaching down to scratch behind the Mastiff's ears. "We'll need to make copies first. Multiple sets. Keep them in different locations. And we'll need to watch our backs," Jonas added grimly. "If Kincaid figures out we have this." The Mastiff pressed against Lydia's leg, solid and reassuring. She remembered how he'd stood his ground against Kincaid's men, protecting both her and the kitten despite his own fears. His courage strengthened her own. "We can't back down now," she said firmly. "Not when we can finally stop him. Not just for these two," she gestured to the animals, "but for all the others who couldn't be saved." The weight of their discovery settled over the clinic like a heavy blanket. What had started as an act of compassion for two abandoned animals had evolved into something far larger and more dangerous. But as Lydia watched the Mastiff guide the playful kitten back to their corner, she knew they had no choice but to see it through. The early morning sun streamed through the windows of Lydia's home office as she and Jonas carefully organized their evidence. They had spent the past 3 days meticulously documenting everything Tucker had provided, creating multiple copies and detailed summaries. State Investigator Sarah Chun, Jonas read from his laptop screen. "She's got a solid track record with complex cases. More importantly, she's based out of the capital, far from Kincaid's sphere of influence." Lydia nodded, sorting through photographs of the illegal fighting rings. "Did she agree to meet?" "Better than that. She's driving down tomorrow." Jonas leaned back, allowing himself a small smile. "Said the initial evidence we emailed was compelling. Enough to warrant immediate attention." The Mastiff dozed nearby, the kitten curled against his broad chest. Their peaceful presence helped steady Lydia's nerves as she prepared her testimony. She had documented every detail of their condition when she found them, including the embedded chain and extensive scarring. "It feels real now," Lydia said softly. "Like we might actually win this." The next morning, Investigator Chun arrived at the clinic before opening hours. She was a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s who carried herself with quiet authority. For 2 hours, she examined their evidence, asked pointed questions, and took detailed notes. "This is substantial," Chun confirmed, reviewing the shipping manifests. "The dog-fighting operation alone would warrant investigation, but these financial records suggest money laundering and interstate trafficking. We'll need to coordinate with federal agencies." Hope bloomed in Lydia's chest. "So you'll take the case?" "Absolutely. We'll need to move carefully, build an airtight case before making any moves. But this could bring down Kincaid's entire operation." Chun paused, her expression growing serious. "That said, you both need to be extremely careful. Cases like this can turn dangerous quickly." Neither Lydia nor Jonas could have known how prophetic those words would prove. The first sign of trouble came 3 days later. Lydia arrived at the clinic to find her medication supplies ransacked, vaccines destroyed, and equipment damaged. The message was clear. Kincaid knew they were building a case, but the real blow came the following evening. Lydia was closing up when her phone rang. The local hospital's number flashed on the screen. "Ms. Brenner," a nurse's voice said. "You're listed as Jonas Kerr's emergency contact. There's been an accident." The world seemed to tilt sideways. Lydia rushed to the hospital, her hands shaking as she parked. In the emergency room, she found Jonas connected to monitors, his face badly bruised and his left arm in a cast. "Break." "Lines," he managed to whisper when she reached his bedside. "Cut clean through. Went off the road near Miller's Creek." Lydia's blood ran cold. Miller's Creek had a sharp turn with a steep embankment. It was a miracle Jonas had survived at all. This was no accident. This was Kincaid, escalating from threats to attempted murder. She stayed at the hospital until visiting hours ended, then drove home in a daze. The Mastiff and Kitten greeted her at the door, but even their presence couldn't dispel her growing terror. She sank onto her couch, overwhelmed by guilt and fear. For hours, she sat in the darkness, questioning everything. The Mastiff rested, his head on her lap, his warm weight both comforting and accusatory. By trying to save him and the kitten, she had put Jonas's life at risk. Was she being selfish, reckless? The kitten climbed onto her shoulder, purring softly, but even that familiar comfort couldn't ease her turmoil. Her phone buzzed. A text from Investigator Chun. "Heard about Jonas. We can arrange protection if needed. Don't let this stop you. We're close." But were they? And even if they were, what would it cost? Jonas could have died. Her clinic was in shambles. How many more people would get hurt before this was over? Lydia buried her face in her hands, tears finally flowing freely. The Mastiff whined softly, nudging her arm with his nose. When she looked up, she saw him watching her with those deep, knowing eyes that had witnessed so much cruelty, yet still held such gentleness. The kitten mewed, pawing at her tear-stained cheek. These two had survived unspeakable conditions, never giving up, never losing their capacity for trust and love. But now, for the first time since finding them, Lydia wondered if she had the strength to see this through. The weight of responsibility felt crushing, the cost of justice impossibly high. She spent the night on the couch, too exhausted to move, too afraid to sleep. The Mastiff stayed by her side, his steady presence both a comfort and a reminder of everything at stake. The kitten kept vigil from the back of the couch, occasionally reaching down to pat her hair with a tiny paw. As dawn broke, Lydia still had no answers. Only questions, fears, and the growing weight of doubt pressing down on her shoulders. She had started this journey with such clarity of purpose, such certainty in what was right. Now with Jonas in the hospital and threats closing in from all sides, that certainty felt like a luxury she could no longer afford. The morning light crept across her floor, but brought no clarity with it. Just the heavy knowledge that her next decision could mean the difference between justice and tragedy, between victory and devastating loss. And she had no idea which path to choose. The antiseptic smell of the hospital room made Lydia's stomach turn as she watched Jonas's chest rise and fall. Bruises darkened his face, and bandages wrapped his ribs where the accident had left its mark. The doctors called it a hit and run, but Lydia knew better. This was Kincaid's handiwork. Back at home that evening, Lydia sat on her porch steps, her shoulders heavy with defeat. The Mastiff lay at her feet, his scarred head resting on her shoes, while the kitten curled in her lap. "Maybe I was wrong," she whispered, scratching behind the Mastiff's ears. "Maybe I should just—" her voice cracked. The thought of surrendering these animals back to Kincaid's cruelty made her physically ill. The night grew darker, and a strange smell tickled her nose. Smoke. At first, she thought it might be a neighbor's barbecue, but the Mastiff suddenly lifted his head, alert and tense. The kitten's fur stood on end. Then she saw it. Orange flames licking up the side of her clinic, which connected to her house. The fire spread with unnatural speed, telling her this was no accident. Someone had used accelerant. Lydia jumped to her feet, fumbling for her phone to call 911, as thick smoke began pouring through the building's seams. The kitten darted to safety, but when Lydia turned to run, she found her exit blocked by a wall of flames that hadn't been there seconds before. Coughing, she dropped to her knees, trying to remember everything she knew about fire safety. The smoke was getting thicker, making it impossible to see or breathe. Her eyes stung, and her lungs burned. Through her panic, she heard heavy panting beside her. The Mastiff nudged her shoulder hard, nearly knocking her over. When she didn't move, he grabbed her sleeve in his teeth, pulling with gentle but insistent pressure. Despite his own limp, he was trying to guide her. "Okay," she wheezed, grabbing onto his collar. "Lead the way, boy." The massive dog moved forward, staying low, pulling her along. Lydia could barely see, but she trusted him completely. The heat was intense, and debris fell around them as the fire consumed her home. The Mastiff never hesitated, guiding her through the smoke-filled rooms with remarkable certainty. When they finally burst through the back door into the cool night air, Lydia collapsed onto the grass, gulping in clean oxygen. The Mastiff stood over her protectively as sirens wailed in the distance. The kitten appeared from the shadows, running to them both. As fire trucks arrived and emergency workers swarmed her property, Lydia sat wrapped in a blanket, the Mastiff still at her side. She watched her home and clinic burn, but instead of despair, she felt something new igniting inside her, pure burning determination. "You saved my life," she told the Mastiff, wrapping her arms around his thick neck. His dark eyes met hers with unwavering loyalty. This dog, who had endured unimaginable cruelty, still had the courage and heart to risk everything for someone else. How could she do any less? The next morning, Lydia sat in Jonas's hospital room, the morning sun streaming through the windows. Though still weak, he was sitting up, listening intently as she recounted the previous night's events. "This ends now," she said firmly, her voice hoarse from smoke inhalation but strong with purpose. "Kincaid thinks he can burn us out, beat us down, make us give up, but he doesn't understand what he's fighting against." Jonas reached for her hand, squeezing it. "What's the plan?" "We take everything we have, the ranch hand's records, the photos, my documentation of their injuries, and last night's arson, straight to Investigator Chen. No more waiting, no more fear." Lydia looked down at the Mastiff who sat vigilant by her chair. "This good boy didn't give up on me. I won't give up on him." Jonas nodded, wincing slightly as he shifted in his bed. "Together then, whatever comes next." "Together," Lydia agreed, feeling stronger than she had in days. The kitten purred from its perch on the windowsill, while the Mastiff's tail thumped steadily against the floor. They were an unlikely team, a veterinarian, an injured friend, a battle-scarred dog, and a tiny kitten, but they were ready to face whatever came next. The Mastiff's act of heroism had done more than save her life. It had reignited her faith in the fight ahead. Looking at him now, she saw not just the scars of his past, but the nobility of his spirit. If he could rise above his trauma to become a protector, then she could find the courage to see this through to the end. Dawn painted the sky in shades of pale pink as a convoy of police vehicles silently approached Kincaid's ranch. Lydia sat in the passenger seat of Investigator Chun's unmarked car, her heart pounding. Jonas, still moving carefully from his injuries, squeezed her hand from the back seat. "Remember," Chun whispered, "once we breach the property, stay behind. The officers. This isn't just about animal abuse anymore. We're dealing with a major smuggling operation." Lydia nodded, watching the massive iron gates of the ranch grow closer. The evidence they'd gathered was overwhelming: financial records, photographs, veterinary documentation, and testimony from the whistleblowing ranch hand. Still, knowing Kincaid's influence, she wouldn't believe it was over until she saw him in handcuffs. The raid began with military precision. Police vehicles surrounded the property while officers scaled the fence at strategic points. The element of surprise worked for about 30 seconds. Then floodlights blazed to life, and chaos erupted. Kincaid's men scattered like startled deer. But it was what happened next that turned Lydia's blood cold. The sound of metal doors clanging open echoed across the compound, followed by barking, growling, and the thunder of desperate animals running in all directions. "He's releasing the fighting dogs," Jonas shouted, pointing toward the kennels. Lydia watched in horror as dozens of dogs, many bearing fresh wounds and scars, similar to her mastiffs, poured out into the yard. Some were aggressive, others terrified, all adding to the mayhem that was clearly meant to cover Kincaid's escape. "The record's building," Chun barked into her radio. "Team 2, secure that office before they destroy everything." Through the confusion, Lydia spotted Kincaid himself emerging from the main house, clutching a briefcase. He was heading for a helicopter pad she hadn't noticed before, partially hidden behind the stables. "There," she pointed. "He's trying to reach that helicopter." But reaching him meant crossing a yard now filled with panicked, potentially dangerous animals. Officers were trying to contain the situation, but they were dividing their attention between pursuing fleeing suspects and avoiding the dogs. Lydia's veterinary instincts kicked in. "Jonas, help the officers corral the dogs. Use the treats and leashes from my bag. They're scared, not naturally aggressive." She handed him her emergency kit. "I'm going after Kincaid." "Lydia, wait." But she was already moving, using her years of animal behavior experience to navigate through the chaos. She skirted around the more aggressive dogs, spoke softly to the frightened ones, and kept her movements calm despite the urgency burning in her chest. Kincaid was halfway to the helicopter when he spotted her, his face contorted with rage. "You," he snarled, changing direction to storm toward her. "You did this. You ruined everything." Lydia stood her ground, though her heart hammered against her ribs. "You ruined everything yourself, Kincaid. With every animal you tortured, every law you broke." He lunged at her with unexpected speed, briefcase swinging toward her head. Lydia ducked but lost her balance and fell. The contents of the briefcase spilled across the ground, stacks of cash and documents, scattering in the pre-dawn breeze. Kincaid abandoned the papers to grab her throat, his face twisted with desperate fury. "I'll make you wish you'd never seen that worthless dog." Lydia struggled, spots dancing in her vision as his grip tightened. Then suddenly, his weight was gone. A massive form had slammed into him, throwing him backward. The mastiff stood over her, his scarred body rigid with protective fury. The little kitten darted between his legs, hissing at Kincaid. Somehow they had followed her into danger once again. "Get them!" Kincaid screamed at his remaining men. "Kill them all!" But his order was lost in the chaos. Police officers had secured the records building and were closing in from all directions. Jonas and several officers had successfully contained most of the released dogs, using Lydia's supplies and gentle tactics instead of force. Kincaid made one last desperate break for the helicopter, but the mastiff was faster. Despite his old injury, he caught Kincaid's leg, bringing him down. The man who had caused so much suffering fell hard, surrounded by the evidence of his crimes scattered across the ground. As officers moved in to handcuff him, Kincaid's facade of power crumbled. "You can't do this to me. Do you know who I am?" "We know exactly who you are," Investigator Chun said coldly, picking up the scattered documents. "And we have everything we need to prove it." Lydia knelt beside the mastiff, wrapping her arms around him as the kitten wound between their legs. "Good boy," she whispered, her voice shaky with relief and residual fear. "The best boy." The sun rose fully as officers led Kincaid away. His former employees, seeing their boss in handcuffs, began cooperating with police, pointing out additional evidence locations. Animal control vehicles arrived to safely transport the rescued dogs to emergency veterinary care. Jonas limped over to join them, looking exhausted but triumphant. "It's really over," he said, watching Kincaid being placed in a police car. "Look at him now, not so untouchable after all." Lydia nodded, still holding the mastiff close. The kitten had climbed onto his broad back, assuming its usual perch. Together, they watched as the man who had terrorized them all was driven away. His power broken in front of the very community he had once controlled through fear. "We did it," Lydia said softly, scratching behind the mastiff's ears. "All of us together." The dog's tail wagged gently as morning light spilled across the ranch, transforming a place of darkness into one of newfound hope. In the weeks following Kincaid's arrest, Fairview transformed. The shadow that had hung over the town lifted, replaced by a sense of justice and renewal. The courthouse buzzed with activity as prosecutors built their case, armed with the evidence Lydia and Jonas had helped uncover. On the morning of Kincaid's sentencing, Lydia sat in the courtroom's front row, her hand clasped tightly in Jonas's. The mastiff and kitten waited safely at home, their testimony already given through the physical evidence of abuse and neglect they had endured. "Judge," Martha Wilson's voice rang clear through the hushed courtroom. "Harold Kincaid, you have been found guilty of multiple counts of animal cruelty, illegal gambling, smuggling, and attempted assault." She peered down at him over her glasses. "Your actions represent not just lawlessness, but a fundamental betrayal of this community's trust." Kincaid stood diminished in his orange jumpsuit, his former arrogance replaced by defeated anger. When offered the chance to speak, he remained silent, avoiding the eyes of his victims and former employees who had testified against him. "This court sentences you to 15 years in federal prison," Judge Wilson declared, "with no possibility of parole for 10 years. Additionally, you are barred for life from owning or working with animals in any capacity." The gavel's sharp crack echoed through the room. Lydia released a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding, tears of relief sliding down her cheeks. Jonas squeezed her hand, his own eyes glistening. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered to hear statements from the prosecution team. But Lydia's thoughts were already turning toward home, where her unlikely family waited. The transformation of her modest house into a home for both her and the animals had been gradual but profound. The mastiff, once so wary, now greeted her, each evening with gentle tail wags, his dark eyes filled with trust instead of fear. The kitten, having fulfilled its mission to save its protector, had blossomed into a playful companion, though it still preferred to sleep curled against the mastiff's broad chest. That evening, Lydia and Jonas sat on her back porch watching the sunset paint the sky in soft pinks and golds. The mastiff lounged at their feet, the kitten perched regally on his back as always. "Remember that first night?" Lydia asked softly, running her fingers through the mastiff's fur. "When I saw this little one under the streetlight, trying so hard to get my attention." Jonas smiled, his arm warm around her shoulders. "You were terrified of approaching them. Look at you now." "Look at all of us now," she corrected, leaning into him. The past months had changed them all. Jonas had recovered from his injuries, though he sometimes still favored his left leg. Their friendship had deepened into something more, built on shared courage and unwavering support. The veterinary clinic had flourished, with Lydia's role in bringing down Kincaid, earning her respect throughout the community. She'd expanded her practice to include rehabilitation services for rescued animals, turning trauma into healing. "You know," Jonas said thoughtfully, "I always knew you had this strength in you, even when you doubted yourself." Lydia watched as the kitten stretched and repositioned itself on the mastiff's back, a habit that had once been about survival but was now pure comfort. "I learned it from them," she said. "The way they never gave up on each other, even in the darkest times." The mastiff lifted his head at her words, his soulful eyes meeting hers. The scars from his fighting days would always mark his body, but they were now badges of survival rather than shame. The chain that had once embedded in his neck was gone, replaced by a gentle collar that he wore with dignity. "We're thinking of expanding the rehabilitation program," Lydia continued, her voice growing animated. "There are so many animals out They're who need a chance at healing, at trust. What we learned from these two, it could help so many others. Jonas nodded, his expression warm with pride. From rescuing a kitten in the rain to changing lives across the county. Not bad for someone who used to think she wasn't brave enough to make a difference. The kitten chose that moment to leap from its perch, landing in Lydia's lap with characteristic grace. It butted its head against her hand, purring loudly. The mastiff shifted closer, resting his chin on her knee, creating their familiar circle of connection. Lydia scratched both animals behind their ears, her heart full. "You know what amazes me most," she said softly. "How love can look so different from what we expect. A tiny kitten protecting the battle-scarred dog, a vet finding her courage, a friendship becoming something more." She smiled at Jonas. "Sometimes, the most beautiful things come from the most unlikely beginnings." The last rays of sunset gilded the scene in gentle light. The mastiff's tail thumped contentedly against the porch boards. The kitten's purrs filled the peaceful silence. And in that moment, Lydia knew with absolute certainty that this was exactly where they all belonged, not just safe, but home. "We did it," she whispered, echoing her words from that decisive dawn at Kincaid's ranch. But this time, they weren't just about victory. They were about healing, about family, about the kind of love that transforms lives. Jonas pressed a gentle kiss to her temple. "We did it together." The kitten stretched up to touch its nose to the mastiff's, a gesture that had once been about survival, but was now pure affection. In their unbreakable bond, Lydia saw reflected all the beauty that could grow from darkness when courage, compassion, and love lit the way. As night settled softly around them, their unlikely family remained together on the porch, their shared warmth a testament to the power of second chances and the endless possibilities of the heart. If something today spoke to the part of you that still believes in love, stay a while. Subscribe. I'll be here again tomorrow with another story worth feeling.